patrol. Van Diemen spit the Turian Concordat, 26th of the 2nd, 3052. 11:35 a.m. 42 degrees. 94% humidity. Thick, coarse scrub lined the dune. Patches of dazzling white sand illuminated by a glaring sun, scarcely managing to break through the dense viridian and weather-beaten bronze of the robust and assertive local fauna. Motion erupted as a resounding shriek echoed from the nearby hills, signaling the disruption of a flock of nesting pelagic raptors. Fierce aerial predators sent bursting into the sky on sleek black wings. The sudden movement resulted in a cascading effect on the inhabitants of the spinous foliage, as a wave of small, furry creatures bolted from open spaces for sturdier cover, disrupting reptiles, insects, and several smaller birds who had already claimed the space. Cacophonous grunting, chirping, and rustling resounded, then settled into total stillness as a multitude of living things froze in high alert. Garret swore audibly as rocks clattered on the ground below, then hastily readjusted his footing to continue the descent. If, as he suspected, anyone was actively poaching specimens of the unique microbiome in the gargantuan crater he'd self-assigned for routine, albeit sorely overdue reconnaissance, they now would be alert. He released the harness and dropped the last few meters, landing harshly on the sand below, luckily avoiding a particularly nasty-looking patch of barbed spinifex by a few less centimeters than he would prefer. The patrol uniform of the constabulary was designed for sustained operations under adverse conditions, and dispersed or absorbed the majority of the damage that might have been inflicted by the jagged, hematite-rich rocks scattered around the clearing. Judging by the length, approximately 10 centimeters, thickness, 5 millimeters, and the number of desiccated, impaled, skeletal remains attached, 3. The spines would breach the polymer alloy without significant resistance, to say nothing of his flesh below, and the oily fluid welling at the tips of the spines, he estimated would be likely excruciatingly painful or mercifully brief. Garret Fysh had served in the Concordat Constabulary for close to 3 years now. One more rotation, and his period of mandatory service to the Turian Concordat was practically complete. In exchange for his service, he would, and had, enjoyed the benefits of full citizenship, a level of individual freedom, liberty, and opportunity he had heard, based on barroom conversations with interstellar travelers, mercenaries, and merchants, was practically undreamed of within the wider sphere. After graduating from the Turian Ministry of Intelligence Academy on New Vandenberg, he had spent most of his time on active patrol, assisting planetary police forces and militia in alignment with new reforms designed to reintegrate the Concordat Constabulary with the local population. His current assignment had seen him return to Brisbane 3, coincidentally the planet of his birth, to investigate and resolve information provided by local agencies that poacher activity had increased by a significant extent as the result of tenuous resumption of external trade with the bordering realms. Unfortunately, his adolescent experience amongst the highly populated urban centres of the Northern Hemisphere had not granted him sufficient experience with the local terrain of the southern exposures to aid on an investigatory expedition of this nature. He felt like a foreigner on his own native soil, an obvious and obnoxious intrusion upon the pristine and largely unexploited reaches of the hostile, scattered landmasses of the fringe regions. His only practical hope was that the poaching operation he sought was even more alien in its interactions with the endemic environment. If they had recruited local citizens familiar with the quirks of geography and wildlife required to operate long-term with no significant footprint, he may never get a hold on any information significant enough to warrant an interventionary response, and the key players would continue to operate unimpeded, reaping natural resources and encouraging further investment and exploitation. The information he had been provided with, however, suggested a more brazen approach, and if he could find a weak link in the operation, he knew how to apply the right pressure from higher up to crack the whole ring wide open. Brisbane 3 was a world largely dominated by water, with most landmasses consisting of island chains and archipelagos, the majority of which were clustered in the Northern Hemisphere, site of naval command, capital city, and major industrial water purification centres. As a result of the world's commercial significance, and the historic mass poaching of the Brisbane dolphin, an intelligent water-dwelling species whose iridescent skin attracted unfortunate interest from the idle rich. The Terrean Defence Force invested in a planetary grid of oceanic radars, which meant any unsanctioned activity on the water surface would result in immediate and potentially lethal action by naval or aerial support element. Significant concentrations of dense mineral outcroppings and oblique lateral geography rendered the surface mapping useless on terrestrial spits, and the sparsely populated nature of the southern regions, coupled with a liberal Terrean attitude towards personal freedom, meant that activity on land was largely self-regulated. So Garrett's intuition was that if a poaching ring was active here on Brisbane 3, they'd be headquartered somewhere here. Based on the number of dead ends, and the lesser, although deeply more concerning number of dead agents, an operation with a significant presence was aggressively ensuring secrecy by any means necessary. After spending a few days chasing ghosts between the local harbour towns, he decided to give up on stumbling across conspicuous people in favour of heading out into the outskirts on a locally chartered hover skimmer in the vain hopes of stumbling across conspicuous wildlife instead. One of the fisherfolk he'd spoken to had mentioned an impact crater on a nearby island. A scarred, reclusive sort who may have had a streak of poacher in her based on the way she'd avoided speaking of much of substance at all, until thoroughly convinced Garret couldn't waste time seeking to incarcerate single operators. The irony of which transaction was not lost on him. Apparently, the enclosed ecosystem of the Grove had resulted in the emergence of a number of unique species not found amongst the wider population, and after expressing concern, in the form of rough expletives, the population numbers seemed to have dropped quickly between visits. She agreed to show him the location in exchange for his amnesia regarding the source of the information, or any knowledge of local poaching activities. He scurried along the cliffside to a spot where an indentation in the overhanging lithography provided cover and shade, then surveyed his surroundings. Activity was slowly resuming as his disruption passed, and no obvious forces had appeared to investigate. Yet, the ground ahead formed a slight incline towards the centre of the crater. Approximately 2 kilometres across, the impact had obviously been traumatic, although the proliferation of life and the filling a bowl with nutrient-rich sand, loam and soil washed in by tropical storms indicated that this environment had been stable for at least a few thousand years. While no large trees or apex predators appeared to have been able to establish a niche, the rest of the ecosystem appeared healthy and diverse. After scanning the horizon again, his vision focused on the middle ground, where he could see 6-legged, furry mammals emerging from the dense scrub to forest for seeds, berries, and arthropods, opportunistically snatching up food with 2 forelimbs and then scurrying away on the remaining limbs to shelter again. The sensation of motion and an uncomfortable pressure drew his attention to his left foot, where a fat-bodied albino cave centipede had dropped from the wall he had inadvertently leaned against, and he observed, as calmly as he could, as the creature engaged in a threat posture, clearly agitated by its sudden disturbance. Garret remained still, heart pounding as the enormous mandibles of the centipede clashed together. He could reach his leg knife without too much movement, but the creature's proximity to his groin made action seem like a desperate last resort. After what felt like minutes, not encountering any further agitation, the centipede lowered its head and scuttled towards the back of the cave, and he watched as his body distended, flattened, contorted, and disappeared through a crevice he would have sworn was half the thickness that should have comfortably accommodated such a monstrosity. Swearing again, less audibly this time, although much more profanely, he advanced around the rim of the crater. After a few hundred meters from the point of descent, he came across a disturbing find. Carcasses littered the ground, strewn across another small clearing in quantities too great and too badly disfigured to count. The stench of decay hit him like a chemical weapon as the wind shifted, placing him downwind, choking putrescence that sent him fumbling for a handkerchief, a mask, an air freshener, anything to block the sensory assault. Settling on and fixing a field rebreather securely to his face allowed him to regain his senses, and he evaluated the state of the bodies ahead. Closer examination revealed that the diminutive hexapodal mammals had been brutally hacked apart, that most of the remains were missing a number of internal organs, and that those left over had been too badly damaged in capture or dismemberment that they'd likely lost commercial value. While Garret was hardly an accomplished xeno-veterinarian, his comprehensive state-funded education had allowed him to correlate the locations of the excised internals with the proximate locations of the liver, heart, and reproductive organs. This confirmed to Garret's satisfaction the poachers were in active operation somewhere in the vicinity. Judging by the extent of the decay, they likely had not been in the immediate area for some time, although they couldn't be stationed too far away, likely within the crater itself. Theoretically, poachers could encamp in the centre, although the lack of canopy meant that this would be an obtrusive choice. More likely, they'd been entrenched somewhere along the base of the rim, in a deeper cavity or cave system, and if not, one of the surrounding islands. While Garret was satisfied, Bureau Command would not treat a single slaughter site as proof of activity. He'd need to continue for more concrete evidence, and that meant running up against the poachers and any bandit security forces accompanying them. Garret was an above-average marksman and decently armed with a regulation-issue Terran Arms XM30 carbine, a compact and highly serviceable bullpup assault rifle, as well as his highly non-regulation Stearns-Nacht Python auto pistol, chambered with grey market AP rounds, discouraged for civilian use by the Turian military intelligence due to their effectiveness against Turian-issued protective vestments. His experience and training should give him a decisive edge over criminal fringes, although he knew he was both a long way from any official backup and would be heavily outnumbered once contact was made, so he had to take this approach carefully. Retreating to the relative safety of the cliffside, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a pair of magnoculars, cycling between optical, thermal, and magnetic resonance imaging. Moving across the vista, the readings returned consistently within the expected range. Just as he was reaching the conclusion that this may have been a further waste of time, and the encampment must be located on an adjoining island, an irregular blip appeared on his thermal scan. Tracking back more slowly, he settled on a noticeable discharge of thermal energy pluming along the crater's northwestern exterior. Judging from the chemical profile indicated by the FTIR data, it looked like the poachers must be burning waste, action that would likely help them avoid detection in the long run, due to not needing to dump waste externally. Today, however, it was exactly the break and secure operating protocol he needed to find his target. Say what you like about poachers, thought Garret. They sure don't seem to recruit him for strategic planning. Van Diemen's Spit, the Turian Concordat, 26/2/3052, 1:05 p.m., 46 degrees, 98% humidity. Rank spat a thick gob, watching with satisfaction as it carved a divot into the sand below. He shook himself off and looked back up at the horizon. Recon duty was a joke, he thought. Nobody would care to look for them out here in the arse end of the world. A few band hands of cards had landed him with boundary detail for the week. Or if that cheating bastard Hector hadn't pulled an extra ace out of his bloated arse, he would have been swimming in narcotics to pass the time. He turned his head to the cages. If he couldn't get high, he could at least organize a pit fight to pass the time. Skimming past the herbivores, bundled in quick ranks for quick export, he settled on a squatly muscled carnivorous lizard. Rank hadn't fed it in days, both to keep it hungry for a scrap and as payback for the bite it had left him with during capture. He had a couple of ideas to what to match it up with, something with a bit of fight in it. Turning his head, he noticed the cage for the crimson bilge crab was wide open. Fuck! Then, more quietly, fuck! Rank knew the cage was locked because he double-checked it after every break. That thing was nasty. Venomous, tough, and clever too. And if he didn't sort it out quickly, he'd either be dead, or worse, have to listen to that bastard Hector run his mouth again. He heard a low noise to his rear, followed by total blackness. Garret lowered his stun baton and took a few pictures. He'd herded the viciously spiked crab quietly but methodically towards the main encampment where the smuggler had been. He'd call it distracted in the official report, and that should buy him enough time to make it back to his landing craft as the creature made his presence known. The hardware he could see just in the immediate area was enough to warrant a full-force response from the constabulary. A number of heavy ground vehicles on standby with a large hangar built into the cliffside concealing God knows what. He'd made it about 900 metres into the scrubland before the first shots echoed behind him, and was almost to the boat before the sounds of gunfire started to ring across the island. They'd found the body then. Better hurry. Once he was at sea, the oceanic monitoring system would resume tracking him, and they wouldn't dare follow him out there unless they were short-sighted enough to measure up against the Chilean Navy. He'd have to wait until he landed at regional HQ before he debriefed, though. He wanted to catch these scumbags with their pants down, and chances are they had at least one bent cog in the local comms array to land this much material without flagging investigation prior. Van Diemen spit the Chilean Concordat. 28 of the 2nd, 3052, 5:59 a.m. local, 24 degrees Celsius, 86% humidity. Garret cast an eye over the control panel ahead of him as the backwash of the dropship faded. Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal. The constabulary had reviewed his debrief and swiftly authorized a heavy corrective intervention. Garret had deployed and is now filmed Amelia TDR-5SE, a reconnaissance variant of the Thunderbolt, adapted by Chilean intelligence for scouting and skirmish operations. Equipped with a Sunglow Type 2 large laser, 3 diverse optics Type 18 medium lasers, and a Delta Dart LRM-10 launcher, the Thunderbolt could engage at a variety of ranges. The real appeal was in the 4-pack of jump jets mounted, giving the 65-ton machine an effective jump range of 120 meters. The irregular geography of the planet made mobility a real concern, and he'd come to appreciate the flexibility provided by the boosters, even if the battle mech lacked the punch expected of its weight class. Accompanying Garret were a TBT-5N, a 50-ton trebuchet equipped with 2 long-range missile racks and secondary medium lasers, providing long-range fire support. A COM-2D, 25-ton commando with 2 short-range missiles and a medium laser for additional scouting and close-in support. And a HPK-4G, a 50-ton hunchback equipped with a Kaliyama big-bore AC-20 and secondary lasers with a single purpose, to cripple or disable any heavy resistance they ran into. They had landed on the far end of the island and should be able to close most of the way towards the smuggler's base, unless they'd drastically ramped up security in the last 2 days. Garret signalled to the rest of his team to move forwards and throttled his mech up to cruising speed, ranging ahead with the commando while the 2 mediums advanced behind. A loud cracking noise was the first herald that things weren't going to go as smoothly as Garret had hoped. Bright light filled his cockpit before the display recalibrated as he watched the commando blazing in his peripheral. One leg was missing entirely, a gap that dragged the eye to the blank space between the glowing metal and the smoking air. Slowly, the machine righted itself as the pilot signaled in. "Clean hit. Looks like a mine. I'm alive, but this thing's not moving anytime soon. Might have to punch out." Garret signaled affirmative, and then cycled to heat vision, hoping to spot any more explosives, assuming they had an external power source. What she saw was of much more immediate concern, although the decision likely saved his life. In the distance, a glow as weapon systems powered up. Garret leaned hard on his jump jets, pushing the mech to a maximum vertical thrust as the beam lanced through the forest and impacted where he had just been standing. "Eyes up, we have company. Coming in hot." A quick message to the rest of the lance was all he had time for as more fire came from the jungle, beams accompanied now by the crack of explosives and the hard reports of autocannon fire as range and location were picked up by the enemy. Garret landed behind a ridge and scanned his display for information. There, the commando was not moving or firing, but was relaying the location of a missile carrier closing in on the flank of the trebuchet. Garret confirmed weapon locks and fired, 10 missiles streaking through the canopy and detonating on the vehicle's surface. It must have been about to fire as secondary detonations rippled through the launcher's tubes and interior, briefly lighting up the horizon as a number of vehicles emerged from the tree. To his left, the hunchback sprinted forwards to close the gap and fired the heavy autocannon directly into a quad-turreted tank who was drawing a bead on Garret's Thunderbolt. A loud detonation as the machine was rendered into dozens of tons of scrap before returning fire streaked across the hunchback's torso, stripping armor across multiple locations. Garret cycled his laser systems, jetting forwards before raking a burn across the lighter vehicles now swarming the hunchback, melting through hover propulsion systems and burning out weapons arrays. From behind, he heard the trebuchet's signature whine as 30 missiles streaked into the trees, detonating against vehicles and cooking any smuggler unfortunate enough to be caught in the blast area on foot. Despite a rough start, things were starting to turn around as the experienced crew of mech warriors were able to outgun and outmaneuver the cheaper pirate surplus crewed by the smugglers. A bone-chilling crack echoed through the caldera, at once lower pitched and sharper than even the first detonation of the anti-vehicle mine. The trebuchet rocked as though hit by a meteor, then the pilot ejected as warnings flared up across the Lance's heads-up display. Ammo explosion detected. The trebuchet lit up in a catastrophic explosion as ammunition cooked off, destroying the reactor's containment mechanism in a chain reaction and completely disabling the mech. Garret swore then, signaled again. That sounded like Gauss fire. Report and identify. No response from the trebuchet, as predicted, or from the hunchback, who was likely struggling to put down the remaining vehicles, but a crackle came in from the pilot of the Commando. Identified Garret. I'm running on minimal power to keep myself off the radar, but I've got eyes on a heavy mech. Sensors read about 75 tons, packing that Gauss rifle, although I can't get a clean read on the chassis. I'm reading identifiers for an Orion, a Wolfhound, and a Stalker, and it doesn't look like any of those to me. I'll keep intel open, but I'm going to have to punch out if that thing so much as looks at me. Garret signaled affirmative, then pulled his mech back behind the ridge to break the Frankenmech's line of sight. He didn't have the guns needed to crack that thing, and didn't fancy his chances of breaking cover to close to melee range against a heavier mech. The hunchback, on the other hand, had the right tool for the job, but was caught up with the heavier vehicles, and was being cut down by inches. If the enemy mech got a clean shot on the hunchback, this was all over. Garret needed to find a way to keep the heavy distracted, while cutting down the heavier vehicles, tying down the hunchback, to buy time to close and fire. Easy plan on paper. Shame he didn't have any paper in the damn cockpit. He fired up the jump jets and engaged, missiles streaking into the vehicles around him as he played the lasers across the location of the enemy mech. A hit was a bonus. He just needed to keep it occupied. Free Garret, thanks for the assist. Breaking wide now, relayed in from the hunchback's pilot. Alright, one down, one to go. Garret waited for the heavy mech to cycle the Gauss rifle as his missile systems locked onto the opponent. A quick flare from the jump jets just as the gun squared across from him was enough to cause the round to strike against the left arm, obliterating a hand actuator, but otherwise causing no notable damage. He prepared to launch all weapon systems at the enemy mech before it had another chance to reload the Gauss, hoping to disable the sensitive weapon system. A second to confirm firing location on the now exposed left torso, a second too long, as a white-hot blue mass of energy erupted from a heavy cannon on the mech's right side. The party-kill heavy particle projector cannon was designed to destroy mechs from close range using plasma magnetically converted from the reactor core itself, and the right side of Garret's Thunderbolt was sheared from the central torso as the LRM, the right torso itself, and the components within are atomized by agitated particles. Garret sweats as an intense blast of heat washes through the cockpit from the weapon, and feedback from the reactor are now struggling to cope with reduced heat-sinking capacity. Garret is pleased for two reasons. He may not have gotten the shot off. The Gauss may be recycling to fire on his crippled mech, but he is still alive. That enough is reason for celebration, as the enemy here was equipped with much heavier firepower than a remote smuggling operation should warrant. The second reason is the AC-20 mounted on the hunchback, now safely within optimal range of the Frankenmech and firing cleanly through the rear torso of the smuggler's mech. The shot placed cleanly through the reactor core, causing it to shut down unceremoniously and topple forwards, cockpit first. Van Diemen spit the Turian Concordat, 28th the 2nd, 3052, 6:45 a.m. local time, 38 degrees Celsius, 91% humidity. Resistance dismantled, Garret coordinated the ground forces, swept the facility, and arrested the remaining smugglers. The various stockpile creatures were scanned, categorized, and flagged for rehabilitation or release, depending on their condition. The weaponry was seized and assigned for further investigation. Entering the heart of the facility, Garret was faced with a mystery. A dead body, shot once cleanly through the head. Interrogation of the prisoners would reveal that this was the leader of the operation, and forensics would determine time of death as approximately 3 hours prior to discovery. The only information available to Y was a note, printed in generic script, reading, "Parameters were to maintain supply of resources without discovery or interruption. Failure will not be tolerated. C." The end.